Okay, we'll go ahead and get started then. I'm going to try to keep this on time as much as we can. Appreciate you all joining. This is Perry Clausen. I'm the Executive Director of the Valley Water Collaborative, and we have about an hour presentation today. It may not take that long. We schedule the times a little bit long, but we try to keep respective of everyone's busy schedule. So, please don't hesitate to ask lots of questions, clarifying and otherwise. And before we get started, I'm going to turn it over to Lydia to give us instructions on how to act on this Zoom call, or not, how to raise your hand and do other things. So Lydia, you want to go to slide 2 and we'll get rolling here.
Christine, do you mind advancing the slide? Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So as Perry mentioned, yes, we have some guidelines to have a most effective Zoom meeting. So I'll review those very quickly. You may see on the side of your screen or at the bottom a participants list that you can see everybody that is in the meeting right now. If you could look at that list and make sure that your name is clearly identified on there, that would be fantastic. If it is not easily identified, if you could go through the process of renaming yourself with your first and last name so that we can capture an accurate representation of the participant list of the meeting today, that would be great. In addition to that, if you are not speaking, please have yourself on mute. This will help cut down on any background noise. We will have some Q&A period, though, during this meeting. That will be an opportunity for you to unmute yourself, and I can help with that if you're having any issues. During those Q&A periods, there's 2 ways that we're asking for people to ask questions. One is by using the raise your hand icon. I will recognize you and then you can unmute yourself to ask your question. The other opportunity is through the chat. If you want to type your question into the chat feature, I can read your question aloud, or I can turn it over to you to read your question, either way. And then finally, if you're having any technical issues, please reach out to me. My email is there on the screen, and I'll see what I can do during the meeting to help you either visually see the slides better or through audio issues, I may be able to help you as well. Thank you so much. Perry, back to you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you too, Lydia. Okay, so the meeting today, do a quick overview on the next slide of the agenda. We had our introductions, and we will, as each segment goes on, you'll hear from the consultants that will be speaking. Richard Meyerhoff with GEI Consultants, and Vicki Kretzinger from Ludorf and Scalmanini Consulting Engineers. So that's just a brief intro. They can introduce themselves again in their segments. And what I want to talk about today is the continued work that's being done in the groundwater quality assessment, a characterization of the public water systems that are in the Modesto and Turlock basins, and then some of the early action plan concepts that we're going to put forward in the plan that's due on March 8th. And then, as always, we want to review where our next steps are in this process of developing plans, submittals, and beginning on some of the early action plans. So we'll go to the next slide real quick and talk about the meeting purpose. Go to, if you would, to the next slide. And the reason we have these meetings is you are considered the stakeholder group. So the stakeholders have some stake in this process as it is developed and implemented over the coming years. We want to also show you some of these preliminary findings from the nitrate water quality assessment. We showed some of those in the earlier meeting, but there's a lot of new faces on this meeting. So we'll try to not be too redundant, but also to describe the efforts we're doing to evaluate where these public water systems are located, and which is going to be important for understanding where there are domestic wells that may be in need of testing or supplying replacement water. And then we've also got some of the early action plan elements to talk about, and then summarize our next steps and schedule. And before we go into that, I want to talk a little bit about Valley Water Collaborative. The next slide, we have, again, we covered this in the earlier presentation, so I won't go into depth on this other than to say that the WDR holders in the two basins form this nonprofit organization, Valley Water Collaborative. And we were officially established in July of this year. We're pursuing a nonprofit status with the IRS 501c3. And they're all of our efforts are focused on developing these management zones, the management plans. And we created the mission you see at the bottom. Really the goal of this new regulation is to make sure we're providing access to residents of safe drinking water, and also engage in these activities of protecting and enhancing the quality of groundwater used as drinking water for residents in the region. And that mission, those last few points will become more apparent as we develop these plans. We'll hear touch on that a little bit today. The next slide. So we're formed as a nonprofit, and our goal is to that was the brief overview of Valley Water Collaborative. So the management zone activities, we have started having stakeholder meetings. As I mentioned, this is the second one. We've also had 2 community outreach meetings, and we expect to have, or we are planning to have another 2 next week. And we scheduled 2 in a row for the reason that we have one at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and one at 6 in the evening, to try to make sure that we give access to folks that are working and may not be able to come on the meetings during the day. And then we're working with a lot of different groups locally to make sure that we can advertise, if you will, these meetings and get as much participation as we can. We've also started reaching out to the GSAs, the Groundwater Sustainability Authorities in the Modesto and Turlock Basin, and really starting to look at ways we can collaborate. There are many mutual goals that we have. So we're going to be talking to them more in detail to figure out where are those places that our programs can complement each other, and more importantly, avoid any duplication of effort. We have mutual audiences, audiences or participants in both of those programs, and we're all tight for money these days, so we don't want to see a duplication of effort where we're having to spend the same dollar twice. We also have a website that's up and running. We're encouraging folks to go to that site opening page. You can sign up to be on the stakeholder meeting announcements or the community outreach meeting announcements. And as time goes on, we'll be sending out updates as to where we are in the program in between these meetings. So if documents are posted or otherwise significant activities, we'll notify folks that are on those lists. And then the management zone characterization, groundwater quality assessment has been completed. So you'll see some of the results of that information here shortly. So one thing I'd mentioned, next slide, just took a couple of screenshots of our website. That's the opening page you see on the left. If you scroll down at the bottom, you'll see the places where you can sign up and get your name and email address in our files. So we'll keep that as current as we can and send us updates. So one of the things that we are beginning to solicit information for, you'll see on the next slide, is the structure of Valley Water Collaborative is as having an administrative business management role for the 2 priority basins, Modesto and Turlock for now, eventually Merced. And what we want to do in each of those, we need to do in each of those basins, is form subcommittees or committees. I wouldn't even call them subcommittees for each of those basins. So we are seeking our Valley Water Collaborative board members to be on these committees, as well as other interested parties. These are going to be the committees that provide region-specific or basin-specific advice and direction as the plans are developed. So these are going to be important, and long-term, they will be major sources of advice and information as this implementation plan is rolled out. So as we begin formalizing this, we will be soliciting, sending out emails for volunteers to be on these committees. And what we expect to do, just as this proceeds and we get the plan submitted in March, is we will likely have one meeting that is split in either half an hour segments or hour segments, however the need is, with both basins. So we'll have a Modesto meeting for the first hour, Turlock for the second hour, or vice versa. So because there is going to be cross pollination, if you will, of stakeholders in both of those basins. So that is, you're going to be hearing more about that. That's encouraging to get these committees active in the development of the plan. So I will pause for a minute and see if there's any questions. Lydia, do you see any hands raised? I don't see any comments in the chat room.
No, Perry, no hands, no comments at this time.
Okay, we can go to the next slide and we'll have Ludorf talk about what's going on with the groundwater quality assessment.
Okay, thanks, Perry. Hi, everybody. My name is Barb Dalgish. I'm a senior hydrogeologist at Ludorf and Scaminiti Consulting Engineers. I've been doing the technical work associated with the groundwater quality assessment and nitrate characterization for the Modesto and Turlock management zones. So I'd like to begin by showing you how we develop the ambient nitrate conditions in the upper zone. Next slide, please. In order to determine what the ambient average nitrate conditions look like in both subbasins, we need to look at our groundwater nitrate data set. So we had collected and compiled all of the publicly available nitrate groundwater data from all the sort of government agencies like the Division of Drinking Water, the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, the California Department of Water Resources, U.S. Geological Survey, et cetera, and supplemented that with requested data from the various counties that the management zone covers. So the nitrate control program, if you didn't know this, it is most concerned with nitrate conditions in what they call the upper zone. And the upper zone sort of relates to depth of the groundwater aquifer that contains almost all of the domestic wells. So their focus is heavily on the domestic wells. This zone captures, so we aim to get the best data set possible to represent as recent a time period as possible without losing too much spatial coverage. So we looked into the data that we had for two different time periods, 20-year time period from post 2000 and a 10-year time period for the last 10 years since 2010. Ambient nitrate in the upper zone was developed for these two time periods by using a spatial interpolation method, which is something called kriging that we used. And it's a geostatistical tool that allows you to use known data points to estimate information at unknown points. So for our analysis, we used a 1.5 mile search radius. That means that we looked from one well within a search radius of 1.5 miles and then estimated what the ambient nitrate would be in between those 2 points. So if we didn't have any well control points within that that 1.5 mile search radius and no other control points were in the area, then we have what is called a gap area. So we would have an unknown upper zone ambient quality. Our analysis utilized nitrate data along a buffer of 3 miles outside of the management zone boundaries in order to determine what the ambient conditions are along the borders. So that's kind of important to know what's going on because groundwater doesn't necessarily care about subbasin boundaries. It can flow in or out, and so it's important to know what's going on those boundaries. And we also attempted to fill in any data gap areas with other wells with data. So since the nitrate control program is mostly focused on that upper zone, there are other wells that might be completed in deeper zones or in zones that are called unknown because they didn't have any data associated with them. So we tried to see if there was any data to fill in those data gap areas. We'll use all this information to estimate the number of domestic wells and the population of residents in potentially impacted areas. So I'll show you all of this in the next few slides. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Okay. These two maps are showing the spatial interpolation of nitrate conditions in the upper zone for the two recent time periods. So the map on the left is using a slightly larger data set and contains average nitrate from wells with data since 2000. The map on the left is the one on the right is a slightly smaller subset of this data and shows you nitrate conditions since 2010. So you can see the location of all the wells used as control points inside and outside of the management zones. They are the colored dots and triangles, depending on whether or not they are in the buffer zone or within the management zone proper. The hatched blank areas within the management zones represent gap areas where the nitrate level is unknown, so due to a lack of control points. You can see from the splash of colors that the patterns of nitrate levels are very similar from one time period to the other. So the map on the left does look very similar to the map on the right. You can also see that the locations of data gaps are similar from one time period to the other. So the eastern side of both management zones and the northwestern area of the Modesto management zone all have the same sort of data gap areas. Based on this assessment of the two time periods, we decided that we should use the map on the right. So we're representing the most up-to-date current data as possible, and we haven't lost very much in the way of control points. Next slide, please. So this table has a lot of information in it. The table shows the comparison of those two maps. So the different nitrate levels that you saw on the map from green to red indicate the estimated nitrate concentration level, where orange and red would be considered to be elevated nitrate levels. And that's where we would want to focus our efforts for outreach and providing clean drinking water to people that are in those areas. So you can see the Modesto management zone on the left and the Turlock management zone on the right of this table. And some things to point out is that the post-2000 and the post-2010 coverage, they're very similar. So the percentage of nitrate levels between both data sets are very similar. And this continues to support our selection of the most recent time period. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is it. This is our map that we're going to be using for the next part of the analysis. So this is the ambient average nitrate conditions in the upper zone using a data set from the last 10 years, so post 2010. Let's see, so as I mentioned before, the red and orange areas are considered to be elevated. The red areas and the red dots indicate wells in the upper zone that have exceeded the drinking water standard. So the drinking water standard is set at 10 milligrams per liter as nitrogen. So the areas in red have exceeded that. So they are unsafe to drink according to the drinking water standards. The shaded orange areas are also areas of interest because they have elevated nitrates. So they're not exceeding the standard, but they will be soon. Possibly, potentially, sorry. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this slide is showing the same map as before, but I just wanted to highlight the wells that were used in the analysis coming from the irrigated land sampling program. So all of the stars on this map are upper zone wells that the irrigated land regulatory program had a sampling point at. So this represents a lot of domestic wells and other ag wells that are completed in the upper zone. So this is just to illustrate how important that data set is to this analysis, because the coverage is all over the map. So it's an important source of nitrate data. Next slide, please. Okay, so I know I mentioned earlier that we would like to try to fill in the data gap areas with any other wells, even if we don't know what their well completion is, if they're completed in the lower or an unknown well depth category. So I went back to the post-2010 data set of all wells with nitrate data, and unfortunately, there was only one well in the lower zone that had nitrate in these data gap areas. So I just want to point that out. So due diligence, we tried to fill in the area where the data gaps are, but unfortunately, there just weren't any wells with nitrate data. So next slide, please. So here's a summary of the nitrate groundwater quality initial assessment. This will be used for the preliminary management zone proposal document, which we have to submit to the regional board on March 8th. Some highlights include the selection of our analysis time period for the post-2010 data. There's excellent spatial coverage due to those irrigated lands, those starred wells on the map that I showed earlier. Gap areas cover a minority of the management zone, so only 15% of the Modesto management zone and only 7% of the land in the Turlock Modesto zone management zone is considered to be a gap area. So that's really good. We have a lot of good coverage. When we look at the amount of land in elevated nitrate areas, so the orange and red areas from the maps before, where nitrate concentrations are above 7.5 milligrams per liter as nitrogen, it represents almost a quarter, so about 24% of the Modesto management zone and 44% of the land in the Turlock management zone. So now that we have our spatial interpolation, we can use that to identify and locate vulnerable populations that need clean drinking water. So next slide, please. Okay, so now we'll get into the characterization of public water systems and discuss kind of where people are getting their water and if their water is potentially impacted by elevated nitrate. So next slide, please.
Barbara, can we pose?
Oh, yeah, let's pause. That's a great idea.
Yeah, see if there's any questions. And let me make just a brief overview statement about the data from the Irrigated Lands Program. There are two ways that the Irrigated Lands is contributing data to this process. One is the trend monitoring network that we have been mandated to set up throughout the East San Joaquin region, and that roughly in 3 counties, Stanislaus, Merced, and Madera is about 30 wells. But the majority of the wells that you see on that map that Barbara showed is from the program that the coalition doesn't manage, the regional board manages, and that is that every irrigated land participant needs to sample their domestic well for nitrates. That data is also posted on GeoTracker, so that's the source of the information that Barbara and Ludorf are exhibiting in that slide. Any other questions?
Perry, we did have a question from Karen Morgan, but I'm not sure if it's been answered. What is the population that is affected?
Yeah, that'll be in a slide, in about 2 more slides. And then Karen, if you need more clarification after that, we can follow up.
Okay. That's it for now, Perry.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks. So to start with, I just wanted to introduce you to the topic of domestic wells versus public water systems. There are a lot of different levels of what's called a public water system. So the largest public water systems are called community public water systems. Those are the ones on the bottom of the little image on the bottom right of the slide. These are systems that are regulated by the state for all drinking water standards, not just for nitrate. Wells in these larger public water systems are tested regularly, and the state can post violations and enforcement actions when chemicals are tested to be above standards in drinking water provided to customers. So many of the larger public water systems and some of the smaller public water systems can have water treatment techniques, such as reverse osmosis or others that reduce the levels of contaminants before being served and distributed to their consumers. So we are interested in what happens if you live outside of the boundaries of these public water systems and rely on a domestic well or one of the smaller public water systems that doesn't have treatment capabilities. So if you're located in an area where we have identified that there is elevated nitrates in those orange and red areas from the maps before, you might qualify for free clean drinking water or some testing of your domestic well through implementation of the early action plan. So next slide, please. So our first task in identifying the vulnerable domestic wells and the vulnerable population is to plot the approximate locations of all domestic wells on top of the ambient nitrate conditions map that I showed you earlier. The Department of Water Resources provides a coverage of domestic wells that is updated weekly based on well completion reports received from drillers across the state. Although there is definitely some uncertainty associated with the location of these domestic wells, and there's no attempt by DWR to remove any destroyed domestic wells from their data set. This is our best source for locating domestic wells in the management zones at this time. Another part of this analysis is to consider the extent of the public water systems that I mentioned. So the idea here is that residents with any public water systems service area might have access to clean drinking water already, and the early action plan may not apply to them. Of course, that assumes that the public drinking water system is in compliance. It doesn't have a nitrate problem because maybe their wells are deep enough not to be impacted yet, or they have nitrate treatment or blending capabilities to ensure safe drinking water. The number of domestic wells potentially impacted by elevated nitrate is complemented by the most recent available census data from 2010 that can help us estimate the population, getting back to Karen's question. So we'll be looking at the estimate of population of potentially impacted people with elevated nitrate. Again, we want to consider the boundaries of public water systems in case those population already have access to clean drinking water. Next slide, please. So this map shows the same ambient nitrate conditions you've already seen in several previous slides, but here on this map, you can see the locations of domestic wells. So those are the black dots on the map. You can also see on this map the locations and boundaries of known public water system service areas in the area. So those are outlined in purple and are filled with diagonal hatching. You can see that spatially there seems to be a lower density of domestic wells within the public water system service areas, such as the cities of Modesto and Turlock. And that makes sense since those people would not be relying on domestic wells. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go through the numbers of domestic wells in each management zone. So for the Modesto management zone, shown on the map in the upper right of the slide, we see that 78% of domestic wells occur outside of the public water system boundaries. So that's a big majority. Of that portion of domestic wells, a total of 353 domestic wells have been tested recently to have nitrate levels above the safe drinking water standard of 10 milligrams per liter as nitrogen, and plot in the red shaded areas of the map. 186 domestic wells are considered to have elevated nitrate levels, so they're in the orange area. We're reporting the number of domestic wells within the public water system boundaries just in case. So the kind of transparent cells on the right side of this table, we're providing this information, even though these domestic wells are located within known public water system boundaries, since we have no confirmation that they're not using these domestic wells for drinking water, we're going to include them in case those residents are, in fact, potentially impacted by elevated nitrate. So that would be the 42 wells in the orange on the right side and 70 wells in the red on the right side of that table.
Okay, Barbara, excuse me, the slide is cut off on the bottom. Can you read those total numbers for us across the each of those columns, number domestic wells?
Let's see.
I have it in front of me.
Okay. Let me see if I could pull that up too.
Barb, I have it if you need it.
Okay. So there's a total of 1,291 domestic wells outside of the public water system areas. So that's the bottom leftmost number, which represents 78% of the total wells in the management zone, in the Modesto management zone. There's a total of 354 domestic wells within the known boundaries, which represents about 22%. So there's a total of 1,645 domestic wells in the Modesto management zone, according to DWR's data set as of last week.
Thank you, Barbara.
Okay.
Can we get these slides after the meeting?
Yeah, these are always posted on our website after the meeting within a few hours. So yeah, go to the valleywaterc.org and this will be available.
Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to look at what the population looks like in the Modesto Management Zone according to that ambient nitrate map and the 2010 census data. So you can see from the table on the left and the bar chart on the right that the population within public water system boundaries is much higher than the population outside of known public water system boundaries. And of course, this makes sense considering population density is so much higher in cities where they provide treated drinking water. So the population outside known public water system boundaries with elevated nitrate, so that means again the orange and red areas, represent only about 2% of the total population of the management zone. Next slide, please. So now we'll go through the same types of information, but for the Turlock Management Zone. So on the upper left side, you'll see the map of the Turlock Management Zone with the domestic wells. So the domestic wells are the black dots scattered across the map. The public water system boundaries are showed here, outlined in purple with the diagonal hatching. And the ambient nitrate conditions in the upper zone are shown in the red to green shaded areas. So the table on the
Question. Sorry
Yep.
to interrupt.
No.
The 2% figure that you gave in the at the end of the Modesto is that the number of wells that are outside public water systems, or is that the percentage of wells that are impacted with nitrate outside of them?
The 2% was from the previous slide where we talked about population. Yeah. So that was the population.
Population
of people
on impacted wells, or population of
the
people
so 2% of the people living in the Modesto Management Zone live on land where the map is estimating that there is elevated nitrate.
Got it. Thank you for clarifying that.
Sure. I know there's a lot of numbers and a lot of percentages flying around. Okay, so let's see.
Barbara, please go. This one is cut off when you're done. Please sum up the numbers when you're finished.
Yep. Well, okay. Okay. So okay. So you can't see it, but in this management zone, 92% of all domestic wells occur outside of known public water systems. So, question from Jennifer Clary: how many people does 2% of the population of Modesto Management Zone add up to? If we want to go back one slide, thank you. It's that 2,589 plus 4,546. So about 7,000 people. Okay. Sorry, can you advance the slide again? Thank you. So, okay, so 92% of all domestic wells in the Turlock Management Zone are occurring outside of known public water systems. And again, that makes sense since people inside these bigger public water systems would probably not rely on domestic wells for drinking water. But again, we don't know that for sure. Anyway, so 50% of all wells in the Turlock Management Zone likely have water that exceeds the safe drinking water standard of 10 milligrams per liter as nitrogen. So that's the 50% that you see in the table next to the red line of about 1,700 domestic wells. So that represents 50% of all of the domestic wells in the Turlock Management Zone. There are less than 300 domestic wells located within public water system boundaries, and the majority of those are located in areas that likely have water exceeding the safe drinking water standard. I'm not sure what happened, but my screen looks fuzzy. Oh, no. Oh, it's zooming. Okay. Okay. Well, when you zoomed out, we could see the bottom of the table. Well, I'll just tell you, the bottom of the table read there were a total of almost 3,100 domestic wells outside of public water systems, and that represented that 92% of all domestic wells. And then the total number of domestic wells in the Turlock Management Zone is about 3,300. So there's a lot of wells in the Turlock management zone. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so again, we looked at the domestic wells, now we'll look at the population. So this slide is showing the distribution of the population in the Turlock management zone. So as we saw in the Modesto management zone, there's a much larger population living within public water system boundaries, but there's still a significant population living within likely elevated nitrate conditions. So if you just look at the bar chart, you can see how that compares with the red and orange areas. Almost 48,000 people, or 24% of the total population of the Turlock management zone, are likely located in areas with elevated nitrate conditions in the upper zone of the groundwater aquifer. So again, that's considering the orange and red areas.
So Barbara, you might pause for a second. We have a good question, I think, from Karen again, and that is, are all of these wells used for homes drinking water supply or for irrigation?
So that's a good question. DWR does not really tell you if a domestic well is being used for irrigation. When a driller fills out a well completion report and submits it to the state, there is somewhere on there where you can check if the well is going to be used for domestic, industrial, municipal, or agriculture uses. So all of the wells that we saw, the driller had checked the box for domestic well. That doesn't mean that they're not being used for irrigation as well.
Yeah, typically the irrigated cropland in these basins has residences that are on their own system, because the irrigation wells are typically very large, 25 horsepower and larger, that aren't really well suited for domestic well use. I'm sure there's exceptions out there, but I would speculate that the vast majority of domestic wells do not serve a multiple purpose of being irrigation as well.
Okay, are there any other questions before we jump into the public water systems overview?
Barbara, did we address the question from Jennifer? How many people does 2% of the population of Modesto MZ add up to?
Yeah, I think we did.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so let's move on. We have a few more slides or actually 2 more slides for the public water systems, and then I'll hand it back over to Richard. So these next 2 slides are going to give you an overview. Oh, here we go. A comment from Karen. A well driller's log also has the yield. Can that be used to narrow down? Can that be used to narrow down what is actually a well used from drinking water or the size of the borehole? Yeah, if it's reported, I guess it could. Yeah. Okay, so
what I'm asking is, we don't want to have such a large count of wells to be responsible for having a drinking water problem when they're not even used for that, I think is kind of what I'm concerned about.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think Richard will get into how the early action plan will be implemented, and that might get into selection of the people that are provided clean drinking water. Okay, so now we'll talk about the public water systems. So this map is showing you the location of, you might recognize that purple purple outline with the hatched. Those are the known boundaries of public water systems. And then the triangle, the green triangles and the peach colored triangles are locations of municipal wells or public supply wells. So just because we don't know what the public water system boundary is, doesn't mean that there aren't public wells, public supply wells in the area. The green triangles on this map indicate wells that have never had a sample that exceeds the maximum contaminant level, or MCL, or the drinking water standard of 10 milligrams per liter as nitrogen. The peach colored triangles represent public supply wells that have exceeded the safe drinking water standard of 10. So you'll notice that there are many public supply wells that plot outside of those known purple boundary areas. This is because for most of the smaller public water systems, we don't have a mapped delineation of their service areas. I should also note that just because a public supply well tests above the drinking water standard for nitrate does not mean that the water system is out of compliance. So it doesn't mean that they are providing drinking water to their consumers above the drinking water standard. It just means that the well has been tested to have a concentration above that safe drinking limit. So we are currently evaluating the status of compliance as much as possible for these public water systems in each management zone.
Barbara, can you repeat that, please?
Yes, so just because maybe a triangle is a peach colored and it has exceeded, or it has had a sample in the past that has exceeded the nitrate standard, doesn't mean that the water system itself is out of compliance. So they could have treatment capabilities or blending capabilities that would reduce the nitrate concentration to a safe level before providing it to their consumers.
Yes.
So
anything over a 10 is a tier 1 violation. So the well would need to be shut off within, 24 hours of receiving that result. So it can't be used without treatment.
Well, and that's theoretically true, but in practice, it's not.
Okay, and I think there's different levels of regulation as well for depending on the size of the public water system. So the larger ones that are regulated by the state, they would require a cease and desist order. But I think some of the smaller ones that are regulated by the county, I think that the level of regulation might vary. So we're looking into that.
Well, any drinking water supply cannot, legally give water over 10 parts per million. There's only 2 tier 1 violations, E. coli and nitrate. So
But in fact, they don't turn off the source. They issue a do not drink order.
correct.
So Barbara, one other way to elaborate on this though is these are exceedances, one exceedance, and could be more in the last 10 years. Is that correct? This isn't
Yeah.
as of the latest reporting month.
No, that's true, actually. And this isn't just the last 10 years. This is historic for whenever the well was in service.
So it could have had an exceedance, corrected the problem, but we still are retaining that data and reporting it as an exceed.
Yes, because it's important to see where nitrate has been a problem
Sure.
in the past or present. Yeah. Great comments. Next slide, please. So if there's a way to zoom out, that would be really helpful because the bottom of the slide is cut off as well. But this is basically a flow chart showing how we're investigating each public water system. So first we determine if the public water system has had any wells with nitrate data. If they do, and all of their samples tested return nitrate concentrations below that drinking water standard, then we follow the path on the right, and no further investigation would be conducted at this time. If the system has had an exceedance, then we look at the kind of path to the left, and we look at whether or not that water system has treatment capabilities or has no treatment capabilities. If it has no treatment capabilities, then we look to see if nitrate is still a problem. So perhaps they abandoned the well that had a nitrate problem and dug a deeper well or dug a well somewhere else, and now they don't have a nitrate problem, and so they would be currently in compliance. Then we stop investigating that particular public water system. If it's still a problem, so it doesn't appear to us that the problem has been solved, then we would do further digging, and the people that are served by that particular public water system might have to be contacted for participation in the well testing and the free drinking water program. And then if the public water system has a nitrate exceedance, but it has treatment capabilities, then we have to dig into figure out what kind of treatment capabilities that public water system has. Sometimes that's not totally obvious. Sometimes it is, but just because it may have treatment or treated sources doesn't mean that they treat for nitrate. So if it turns out that they don't treat for nitrate, then we do kind of the same thing where we look and see, well, did they drill a new well, abandon that well, do some different blending or something else to determine if they're currently in compliance. And if not, then it might still be a problem. And then, of course, if they have treatment capabilities that does treat for nitrate, then we don't worry about them and we assume that the people drinking that water are safe and healthy. So I think that's it. Richard will go into the early action plan next. So if there aren't any questions, I can pass it over to Richard.
I'm not seeing any raised hands or questions in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Barb. So I'm going to talk briefly about the early action plan. In our last stakeholder meeting, we just briefly introduced it, and I'm going to reuse a couple slides just to make sure we're all understanding kind of the foundation of what the purpose is of the plan. And then talk about, as this slide says, concepts and development. We're pretty close to the point where we need to start putting pen to paper and start drafting ideas of what will go into the early action plan for the management zones. And so we'll bring up the concepts to here, and of course we'll be talking more as we go down the road over the next month or two. So next slide, please. So I'm going to highlight, again, basic requirements and then talk about some of the key elements that go into it. There's a water replacement program and then other components such as outreach and actually identifying who we do need to outreach to the most. Next. All right, so this figure is just a simplified version of one that was shown in the last meeting, is to just remind everyone that early action plan is, the key word is early, and it focuses on what's going to be done now. And now it starts roughly May 8th of 2021. The plan is submitted in March along with the management zone proposal, and then implementation is to begin within 60 days unless directed otherwise by the board. So we're going to anticipate that by early May, these management zones will begin implementing an early action plan, and it will define what those activities are to work with the local community to address the drinking water problems that have been identified. And as Barb just went through, all that data analysis that's going on is to determine where to prioritize the program in terms of early action. It doesn't mean other areas don't get addressed as well, but the focus is on the areas that we know with high likelihood have upper zone nitrate water quality conditions that exceed the objective. In the long term, the green line indicates that the nitrate control program goes on for many years. Early actions are replaced by permanent solutions over quite a long period of time. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so the early action plan has a number of requirements. I won't list the regulatory requirements, but they translate into 4 basic parts. One key part is community engagement, to work with the local community so that they're part of the identification of solutions, not just in the early action plan, but the long term as well. It's typically referred to as community engagement. As Perry talked about early on, we had a round of community outreach meetings in November. We have another 2 meetings next week, December 8th and 9th, to continue that process to outreach to the local community. We're also working with what we call non-dischargers. These are entities that didn't receive a notice to comply with the nitrate control program, but they have interests. Some of you on this phone call have interests. You may not have a discharge permit, but you're participating because you have other water-related interests or water quality-related interests in the area. For example, you operate a water system, or you're part of the environmental justice community, making sure the community is being outreached to. So there's a lot of other entities out there that have interest in the program. And so the regulation requires continued coordination to make sure we're all on the same page. In the bottom right, just quickly, any plan needs a schedule. And of course, in this case, it needs to demonstrate that it's adequately funded to be implemented. And then the bottom left is the key part of the document, which is about what are you going to do in terms of early action. Inherent in this is a well testing program to assist residents to understand whether or not they do have a well that they're using for their drinking water source that might exceed the 10 milligrams per liter nitrate. And then if that's the case, what are the options for replacement water? Next slide. Okay, so from here on, I'm just going to highlight big picture issues more than the weeds. We can easily get in the weeds on a lot of these subjects, and there will be opportunity as the early action plan is actually drafted in written language. You can see what some of the more details are with regards to implementation, or at least what is planned for implementation. Fundamentally, we're looking at a two-part program. One is what we would call centralized water delivery. This is a aspect of the program to reach as many residents as possible in the shortest period of time. And fill stations is an option under that program. These are facilities where a resident can drive up to and actually obtain water. There are people who can't access a fill station for many reasons. And then there needs to be an alternative program for them to participate in to meet the individual needs of homeowners. The intent right now is to build these programs, the capacity of these programs in parallel, establishing the centralized locations, but at the same time, once people know those are available, let them know that there are alternatives for them. Next slide. But just quickly, in case anybody doesn't know what a fill station is, they're becoming more common. Kerman, California. It's down in the King Settlement Agreement, which is outside the nitrate control program, but can be tied to the program. And through that program, they have been working on some solutions in those areas, and fill stations is one of the things they're working on. So this is a typical example of a fill station in operation in that area. Some of the types of things that these are intended to provide is safe drinking water. So the water that goes into that system is tied to a regulated source that is compliant with all regulations. The water is provided at no cost. The resident can drive up, bring as many bottles as they want. They can use different sizes, up to 5 gallons. The facility is maintained by the management zone, so they're sure it's in operation. And the goal is to locate these in locations where they can be accessed anytime. Next slide. For those who need another option, there's different elements that need to be considered. One is, what will those options be? There's two that we're looking at right now. One is a bottled water delivery program. These are active in other places, so there are templates to look at. And of course, point of use treatment systems, which is a very tailored solution for a household to work with the homeowner, or even if it's a renter, to work with that person to install a treatment system at a point in the house where they can then use that treated water for drinking and for cooking. Typically, we would set this up where a resident would request participation. They're made aware of the fill station option, but let them know that if that will not work, then they may participate in this alternative or tailored program. Criteria need to be developed as to how that might work. What we listed on this slide was criteria that were developed through a pilot study that was done in 2019 to kind of test out some of the management zone concepts, particularly the early action plan. What might an early action plan look like? These were the criteria that were considered in that draft, and we will continue to look at those and maybe others that are suggested as we move forward. The question a minute ago about, is the well actually being used as a domestic water source, not used for something else? That might be an element that could get included in criteria such as this. Next slide. Inherent in a program, I should have mentioned in the last slide, one of the criteria was to actually verify that a person who asks to participate in a bottled water program or point of use program actually has a well that is contaminated with nitrate above 10 milligrams per liter. Well, how do we know whether that's the case? You would have to implement a well testing program. The initial target of the program to the early action plan, the box in the middle on the slide, is to focus on those requesting access to a tailored water delivery program. However, the regulations are currently being updated to the regulatory process right now, and in the end, there will need to be a residential well testing program for the entire management zone. And so with that in mind, the well testing program, we want to think about what do we want to start with, and then what is it going to evolve into over time. And one of the things we're looking at is, while we may focus the program initially on the residents we need to target the most, those areas that Barb was showing on a map that very likely have elevated nitrate, in the end, if a resident in the management zone wants to have their well tested, they could reach out and do that. Next slide. The last item I'll mention is, how do you identify affected residents? The regulation is very clear. You need a process to identify them. We initiated that essentially through community outreach that's ongoing right now, but that will need to be expanded as needed to make sure we target the right people for receiving water. The ones that are the highest priority is probably the best way to say it. There's different ways to do that, and we are evaluating those right now. From the left of this figure, there's a very general approach. You just simply, as you all get mailers in the mail, people have mailing lists that they generate that can be obtained. You can just reach out to everyone in the management zone that has an address. That's one way to do it. Another is to become much more targeted, where you actually do a very detailed, it's a GIS-based analysis where you understand the areas that are most likely to be impacted by high nitrate. You look at what's the compliant water systems in those areas, kind of overlay that information and identify the residents located within those areas. That's a very targeted approach, but there's some challenges with implementing that, and that you may actually leave some people out that you really want to target in the overall program. So the box in the middle simply says there's variations on these themes, and these will be considered as we work on developing the action plan. Next slide. I think that was the last item I was going to mention. Nope, there's one more. So the community outreach, as I indicated in the pie chart early on, there's 4 components. Community outreach is a key component. It's ongoing now, but it continues during early action plan implementation and will continue for many years. For example, when fill stations are coming online and become available to the community, you need to let the community know how to access them, how to use them, and the like. When you have a program for people to potentially receive water through bottled water delivery or through a point of use system, you need to let them know. And how do they reach out to the management zone to access that program? So outreach needs to continue. And this is just a listing on the screen here of different things that might be included in the program. Nothing here should be a surprise. The most difficult thing we're all dealing with now, whether you're in your own organization or having this call today over a Zoom link, is that we're focused on virtual meetings now, but the intent was always to have in-person meetings. And so in time, it's hopeful that the community outreach approach, which will be a Zoom meeting, a virtual meeting next week, can transition in time to actual in-person meetings where you can meet with local people and understand the issues that they're dealing with. Timing, frequency, the content of information will be developed and be explained a lot more in the early action plan. And that, I think, was the last slide. So next. All right, so were there any questions on that? It was very high level, but those are the kinds of things we're starting to work on drafting. There'll be an opportunity down the road to take a look at what is being proposed.
Richard, this is Miguel, City of Modesto. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, I wanted to say something just before I forget. So the water service area boundary shown for the City of Modesto includes, and I'm just going to pull this number just from memory, don't quote me on it, but maybe like 19,000 acres that are undeveloped or farmland. So those normally don't have water mains fronting them. So there's about 19,000 acres worth of populated, with maybe a ranch land or something that potentially don't have access to City of Modesto water within our boundary. So when you put up the the list you're creating, just want to make the distinction, not served by public water service area or water service. That means not connected or not within our boundary. Or I just want to make sure those 19,000 acres don't get left out, because
That's a great comment. Yeah, the verbiage is important. That's a great comment. The presumption is when we say boundary, is that these people are actually being served, so they are connected to a water supply system. But maybe the boundary information includes areas that are not actually connected yet. I think part of the process of the implementation, the early action, is we need to look at each of those issues. There's other nuances that have to be evaluated as well, because there are residents that could be missed also under the early action plan because of the way they receive mail. For example, they get it in a PO box or versus an address, actual physical address. So I'm making a note of this because we have a list of things that we don't want where people fall through the cracks. And that's a good example of how somebody could.
Yeah, Miguel, that's a good point. And we're gonna be going through these city boundaries and compare them. And I don't know if you're referring to the city limits or the actual public water system layer that we're using. And Barbara, I'm not sure if you can elaborate on that distinction of the map layer that we're using. It isn't city limits, I don't believe. It's the public water service area.
That's correct.
So Miguel, you and others, Karen, we'd like to, we'll at some point sit down with you and use your local knowledge to give us a first cut at where are these areas that may be in the boundary that are not served by your trunk lines.
Yes, it'll be as easy as me giving you our water shapefile, and then you can see where we have water lines and where we don't.
Same here.
Yeah.
Great.
Yep, send it our way. We'll use it. Please.
And this is an example where the mailing list you design, if you keep it simple, you may reach out to some of those people anyway that are connected. So you kind of have that overlap of potential gray zones, but any analysis we can do up front to be clear on our boundaries is a good idea. Other questions?
Richard, I'm not seeing any hands raised or questions in the chat.
All right. So I think it's back to you, Perry.
Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So our first, you've heard it several times and you will continue to hear it. Our first deliverable is March 8th. We have a lot of work to do in the next couple of months. You will be seeing some, as Richard mentioned, a hard copy, pencil to paper ideas of the approach that we're going to be taking. So this timeline is just an illustration of the meetings that we're going to have once a month, both with the communities and the stakeholders. And again, we use those 2 dates for community meetings just to try to allow flexibility with the time of the day when the meetings are held. And then once the plan goes in, then the early action plan will begin even at March 8th. When it's submitted, we're going to begin planning for the implementation activities of the early action plan. We do have a deadline in May to begin those, but I know that we will be working to put together the framework for starting those actions, if you will, hit the road running in May. So next slide. We have plenty of contact information. We've got our website. If those of you want to do a deeper dive on the salinity, the nitrate control program and the salinity program, which by the way, I'll drop in here that the notice to comply for the salt control program will be coming out in the next couple of weeks. That was also developed during CV Salt. But our website has, as those screenshots I showed you earlier, they have the ability to sign up for any of the stakeholder lists. We encourage you to do that, and we will hopefully not clutter your inbox too much with emails. One thing I have noticed in the last couple of send-outs is, the internet has become so guarded with our internal security systems that some of you are not receiving these announcements, even though you're on your list. So we changed service providers recently to try to facilitate getting through as best we can, but we're still working through glitches. So if you didn't get the announcement for today, it wasn't because, and you were on the list, it wasn't because we didn't try. So the other thing is we will have another meeting in about a month. Announcement will come out in January, and we'll again update you on the status of the work that GEI and Ludorf are doing and other related activities with the management zones. So that is about all that we have for today. If there's any other questions or comments, appreciate them.
Perry, I'm not seeing any raised hands or questions in the chat.
Perry, just the last one from Miguel again, City Modesto. We had a report put together by RMC that went through the exercises of looking at various areas in the Turlock Basin, Modesto Basin, maybe, I forget if it's north or south of us as well, to see which public water service areas had what contaminants and if they were in compliance or not. The document, I think, might be it's dated 2019, but the data might be 2017-18. I got that report I can send your way because it kind of sounded like what Barbara's exercise she's going to go through. Maybe there's something helpful in there that she can use.
Was that a statewide assessment, Miguel, that you saw?
It wasn't a statewide. It was a integrated regional water management plan area. It's ours.
Okay. Yeah, the
And so it was a grant for the DACs. And so they evaluated water systems and sewer systems to see what kind of, which ones were single point use, multiple use, looking at consolidating, were in compliance, not compliance. So they did look at a gamut of things. And so when she was talking about it, it sounded just like that report, you know, in the similarity. Other than just looking at nitrates, they looked at all contaminants.
Great. Yeah, send that over. Appreciate that.
Okay.
Yeah, and anyone else on the call too, if you have information that can help us out, even if we have it, it would be good. You never know, we might miss it in our search for data and information related to drinking water and wells and all the other types of relevant subjects that we're going to be focusing on. Suggestions on what to include in the presentations are also welcome, and emails to us. You have our contact information. You can send them through. So any comments or suggestions for improving this, we'd appreciate. So I think that'll about wrap it up for today. Made it in an hour and 10 minutes. So appreciate everybody's time. Thanks a lot.